Gentleman yields. I just want to say first that the witnesses filled out a truth and testimony form regarding any motivation to impugn your character before this committee is not well served, in my judgment. And perhaps for Mr. Davidson, since he missed your testimony, Mr. Pottinger, why don't you describe the difference between a sector-based approach and an entity-based approach?
Congressman, if you're looking at an entity-based approach, that requires the U.S. government, probably Department of Treasury, to look at each specific company that it wants to prohibit Americans from investing in. So they actually have that authority from the executive orders that emerged from the late Trump administration and the early Biden administration. But only 68 companies, to my knowledge, were ever actually designated for prohibition on U.S. Investment into Chinese military-affiliated companies. So a sector approach, the idea is you don't have a barn full of analysts, God bless them, over at Treasury. They're often having to divide different problem sets as well. I mean, I've been over there when I was in office. If North Korea's testing a nuke or a missile, that team has to really shift to start targeting North Korean entities. And by the way, Iran's creating problems. Russia's now launched the biggest war in Europe since World War II. That Treasury team is getting spread very, very thin. I know how hard they work. If you have a sectoral approach that just says, look, Americans, U.S. persons are not allowed to invest in these particular sectors that are relevant to China's military and surveillance state, as well as Russia's, North Korea's, and Iran's, it makes it simpler, and it's less resource intensive for the U.S. government.
So it, in fact, provides more clarity to the private sector and businesses, correct?
I would argue it provides more clarity, yes.
And entity can be changed overnight in China, correct?
Sure.
And so a sector-based approach would get around that.
Well, one of the things I mentioned earlier is that China has systematically shut down the research enterprise in China so that it's harder for foreign companies to acquire real-time information about ownership structures, supply chain flows, and the like. Those companies are being systematically rolled up and dismantled or co-opted to serve and align themselves with the Chinese Communist Party's.
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
And I'm not finished yet. We attempted to sanction under Treasury Hickson, which is a state surveillance company on the Uyghur Muslims. And guess what the Treasury Department said? In a letter to me and the ranking member, can't be done. So I guess it depends on who's at the Treasury Department. But yes, I will yield.
Is the gentleman's contention then that that OFAC and the current sanctions regime is inadequate to the task of preventing sanctions evasion?
I think the question is what's most effective. And I think the sector-based approach is going to be a more effective way to capture capital flow investment into these 5 sectors that we know are responsible for the buildup of the PLA and their war machine. An entity-based approach can be manipulated by the CCP, as the former Deputy National Security Advisor to President Trump has just told this committee and testified to. I'm not saying that sanctions aren't an effective tool. In fact, Mr. Barr and I have had many discussions trying to come to some sort of rational, conclusion to this, but it has to be in good faith. And I think, you could take the best of both, perhaps, and that's precisely what we're working on.
Hopefully we'll wind up with good amendments. I yield back.
All I really care about, sir, is we got to stop selling China the technology. We got to stop investing in their war machine, particularly at this dangerous time that we find ourselves in as we look at Taiwan and the Taiwan Straits, and you look at TSMC and semiconductors and the whole thing. So I appreciate your spirited debate. Chair now recognizes Mr. Mills.